watching as well. So give me 1 second. So thank you everyone for attending the online Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness listening session. This is powered by the MVP planning grant in which the town of Southborough acquired in an effort to both become an MVP certified community, which will open us up to climate change, resilience projects and funding opportunities for those projects, and also in an effort to update our local hazard mitigation plan, in which the town has been trying to work on as well. So with the MVP planning grant, we were able to use those funds as the required match used for a grant gotten or received by Neal Freeze from the fire department. And to start this off, a core team was put together that included myself, Melissa Danza as the conservation agent, Karen Galligan as the DPW director, John Parent, who is the facilities manager on the town side, and Neal Freeze, who's the with the fire department and also the director of operations for the Southborough Emergency Management. And we have been committed to working on this. This is a culmination that Daniela from Power Corporation will be explaining in a minute from our stakeholder meeting, which consisted of citizens at large, public members from boards and committees, as well as some of the larger companies that are in Southborough, including utility companies and state agencies, along with some of the local engineers in schools as well. So with that, I will open it up to Daniela. We are going to do questions and comments at the very end, but you are more than welcome to type in the chat to the panelists and attendees if you have that option, and we will hit those once we get to that point. And when we do reach the comment section, we will be utilizing that raise hand feature so we can make sure that the appropriate person is speaking and everyone gets their chance. So if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat and we will do our best to acknowledge them as we go along. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Melissa. Melissa already introduced me, but I am Daniela Abbott. I'm with Power Corporation, and we were the facilitators for the MVP workshop for the town of Southborough. And this presentation is going to give you an overview of what the MVP program is, what the workshop was, and then an overview of what the findings and the outcomes of the actual workshop were. As Melissa said, I'll try to keep track of any questions that come in through the chat, but we will also take questions at the end of the presentation. Bear with me, I'm trying to, there we go. So Melissa covered some of this already, but what is the MVP program? It's the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. It's a state-sponsored program that helps municipalities participate in a planning process to identify resilience needs to help improve climate resilience within communities. It looks at the hazards that affect communities, the critical assets within the communities, and then identifies actions that the community can take to help improve resilience. And what does resilience mean? Resilience is the community's ability to bounce back after a major hazard event. Think, you know, a severe blizzard or a heavy rainstorm, and if things are flooded or damaged. Resilience is your ability to bounce back after those events quickly and with minimal, you know, financial burden. It is also a community-led process. As Melissa explained, we put together, well, she put together a core team of representatives from the community that kind of guided this process. They came together and put a list of community stakeholders that were then invited to participate in the workshop that we had back in March. So it is a process that really integrates the members of the community into identifying these priority actions within the community. It also helps reinforce town partnerships because you have stakeholders that represent different groups. You know, we had Board of Selectmen members that participated in the workshop, community groups, environmental groups, business owners. And so bringing all those together kind of helps reinforce those town partnerships and work towards a common goal of increasing climate resilience in Southborough. Having different towns participate in these efforts also helps the state identify the priorities within the communities and identify areas where more resilience work and more resilience funding is needed. So it really is kind of a really big group statewide effort for Massachusetts to build community resilience statewide. Participating in the MVP program and completing the MVP planning process does make you earn you the designation of being an MVP community and opens up additional funding opportunities. So you can identify hazard mitigation and climate adaptation projects that are priorities for the community and then apply for funding for those. It allows you to take the efforts that are already ongoing within the community, projects within the town and within the community that will help build community resilience. Those are also identified through this process and then can receive additional funding to help implement them more quickly. And then last, but certainly not least, a big part of this process is integrating this municipal vulnerability preparedness process and the climate resilience and adaptation efforts, incorporating those into your hazard mitigation plan. So the hazard mitigation plan already, identifies the hazards within the community and identifies actions to take to help mitigate damage from hazards within the community, and including climate change and the impacts of climate change into that process makes it a more robust plan that helps you identify further actions that you can take. So what are the outcomes of the MVP planning process? The first one is the MVP summary of findings. That's kind of what we're going to cover at the end here. That summary of findings gives you a rough layout for a resilience plan for steps and actions that you can take to improve community resilience. Those steps and actions are then incorporated into your hazard mitigation plan, which, like I explained before, makes it a more robust and comprehensive plan. The MVP planning process includes public listening sessions, which this is the first one. We will have another one when we have a draft of the new and updated hazard mitigation plan. You also can develop a prioritized implementation plan where you identify your critical and priority actions through this process and can incorporate them into your existing town functions, like your budget, obviously, and capital improvement plans. You just create awareness for these actions so that you can work on implementing them into town operations. The most important step is that from the MVP plan, we can identify projects that are good candidates for MVP action grants. So the MVP program has this planning step, and the next step is the action grants, where there is funding available to implement the projects that were identified during the planning process. The MVP program also requires an update every 5 years, much like a hazard mitigation plan, and it creates a document that allows the community to make the town accountable for the commitment to improving community resilience. So putting it in writing kind of makes it easier to implement the projects. This is the format that we used for the workshop. The core team and background materials were the preparations that we did before. We put the core team together. PAR engineers. Oh, yes, sorry. I will correct what I said before. Hillary King from the MVP program is here with us. The MVP plan requires a yearly report to update the state on the progress and changes in the MVP plan. Your hazard mitigation plan has to be updated every year, and that is where the updates to your most municipal vulnerability and climate adaptation efforts will be included. But the MVP plan does have yearly reporting and progress reports that are required to maintain your MVP designation with the state. So back to the workshop format. We put together the core team and prepared background materials. Background materials were a series of maps that kind of characterized some of the hazards and some of the vulnerabilities in the town, and just kind of laid out the framework for the discussions that were going to happen during the workshop. We also did a characterization survey for all the stakeholders. We just gathered some feedback from them to get their initial perceptions on the vulnerabilities within Southborough, so that we had more information going into the workshop. The first step in the workshop was to have a discussion of the hazards, like what are the hazards that matter to Southborough, what impacts us. Once we had completed that group discussion, we break out into small individual groups. I think the groups had somewhere between 8 and 10 people. Each of the groups had 2 facilitators from we worked with a subconsultant called Linnaean Solutions. Between PAR Corporation and the Linnaean Solutions, we had a facilitator who was a trained MVP facilitator for each group to help guide the discussion and the development of the findings for the MVP process. And in that small group workshop, there were 3 separate tasks that we work on. We identified the community's vulnerabilities and strengths. Then we identified actions to address those vulnerabilities, or to address the vulnerabilities or enhance the strengths within the community. And then the last step is to look at that whole list of actions and prioritize them. What is high priority? What is middle priority? And what is low priority? And what's the timeline for each of those actions? After that small group discussion, we all came back together and discussed the findings for each group. Each group selected their top 3 priority actions. We discussed all those top 3 for each group as a whole group. And then all that information got combined and compiled into a draft summary of findings report, which is what we are just going to be presenting today. And then we present it to the public, solicit comments, incorporate those comments into the report. And then once the report is completed and approved by the state, we can move into the implementation aspects of the MVP process. So now I'm going to give you a little overview of the information that we actually considered during the workshop. So we talk about hazards and throw that term around here and there. What does that actually mean? Hazards due to climate change are roughly broken down into 4 different categories: extreme weather, sea level rise, precipitation, and extreme temperatures. All those 4 impact the infrastructure, the society, and the environment within your community. So that's kind of the framework of how we're looking at these impacts from climate change. In Southborough, not all of them apply. Sea level rise certainly probably is not a concern directly in Southborough, but it does impact the rest of the state and can have financial implications for the town of Southborough. So we had an overview discussion of all these hazards and discussed the most critical ones for Southborough, and that's kind of what led the discussion going on. So what does climate change in Massachusetts look like? Massachusetts is experiencing extreme weather. They're experiencing sea level rise. They're experiencing changes in precipitation and rising temperatures. And there's different levels for that, but the state has compiled all the best available science and data out there and created, I think they call it a repository for climate change data that has, scientifically backed projections of what climate change is going to look like in Massachusetts for the next 20, 50, 100 years. And that is our primary reference for the MVP program. We use the data that the state through the MVP program has compiled and made available to us to ensure that everybody is creating these plans using the best available scientific data and the best available projections of what climate change is going to do and mean to Massachusetts. So what do each of these 4 categories of climate change actually look like to us now? Extreme weather is probably the one that is the easiest to relate to. That's hurricanes, blizzards. The frequency and intensity of these storms has been increasing drastically over the last 10, 20 years. The amount of money being spent on storm recovery and disaster recovery goes up year after year. That is seen on a national level, it's seen on the state level. And the overall, looking at our disaster response, every dollar that we spend on disaster mitigation, or every dollar that we spend ahead of time trying to minimize the impacts of these extreme weather events, saves us, depending on the source you use, $4 to $6 and after the storm in recovery costs. So there is a significant benefit to trying to minimize the damages inflicted by these extreme weather events. So here in New England, we have a long shoreline in Massachusetts. It's very vulnerable to coastal storms and hurricanes. We have blizzards and snowstorms that have wreaked havoc in our cities and towns, and they happen more often, they're more severe, and they cost us more and more money every year. Sea level rise is one that probably gets referenced the most when talking about climate change. Boston particularly has some very, very big challenges in the next 30 to 50 to 70 years. There's a lot of discussion and talk about how to help mitigate some of these efforts. This is something that doesn't impact Southborough directly. You're not going to have high tide flooding your streets, but it can have a severe economic and financial impact on the state as a whole. And so it does kind of become everybody's problem. And it's a big one to tackle and to figure out a solution for. Changes in precipitation, that is the most apparent one, and that is the one that has the greatest impact in inland communities like Southborough. More flooding in your streets, overloading your stormwater systems. There's a lot of negative impacts to increases in precipitation. And the projections are that by 2050, there'll be an increase between 10 to 42% in the, sorry, I apologize. by 2050, there'll be an increase in 10 to 20 or 42% of the projections from the state regarding the increase in precipitation for the next 30, 50, and to the end of the century, on how much extra precipitation we'll be seeing on an annual basis in the state of Massachusetts. So days with more than 1 inch of precipitation is going to go up drastically across the state. And that's where you see your culverts backing up, your roads flooding, and a lot of very concrete impacts that your town has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Rising temperatures is another one that sometimes gets overlooked, but the number of high temperature days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit is projected to increase by 6 to 22 days per year by 2050. So that has an impact on seniors, on kids attending school without air conditioning. It takes a toll on your public infrastructure. And so there are kind of underlying, somewhat invisible impacts of rising temperatures to the community. And that is something that it is also considered within the MVP process and identified as a concern. So what is the MVP workshop? In the MVP workshop, before the workshop, we prepared a series of maps and resources. You can see an example on the right-hand side of the screen right now. I think we had a series of like 20 maps that just had different kinds of data to put some of these issues and concerns in context, and to show, where are your FEMA flood zones? What are the areas of low-lying areas of concern? What is the topography, roads, evacuation routes? Where are your public safety facilities located relative to these roads and neighborhoods? And they were a tool to help guide these discussions and provide people with information to kind of put their thoughts and their feelings regarding some of these hazards into context on a map. On the top right-hand side, that is the matrix of information. Each group at the workshop gets had a blank matrix that looks exactly like that. There's a process for filling it out as you go through the workshop. And that is the matrix that helps guide the data collection through the process. So we fill out hazards and assets and actions, and it helps each group organize the information so that we have information from each separate group in the same format and can compile it all into the summary findings report that we're reviewing here. I kind of covered most of this already, but we had the mapping resources. We had also those mapping resources uploaded to laptops that we had with us for the workshop, so we could zoom in and show participants different elements within the maps and zoom into different areas and kind of help illustrate some of the things that we were talking about. The core team that had been developed before the workshop, they all participated in the workshop as well. They were assigned to different groups during the workshop so that they could help the facilitator, and bring some more town context to the discussion, because they're involved in the town's day-to-day operations and have good knowledge about the issues being faced by Southborough right now. We had the facilitation team, which was a combination of MVP facilitators from Par Corporation and Linnaean Solutions. We came together to help guide the discussion. As facilitators, we guide the discussion and collect the data. We don't participate too much in the discussion because we're not the stakeholders in the community. We don't have the firsthand knowledge of the community and the issues within the community, but we are trained in how to lead the discussion and what kind of information we need to provide and collect to help formulate this plan. And then the most important part of the workshop is having a diverse group of community stakeholders. So in March, we had, I believe, between 20 and 30 community stakeholders that attended and participated in the workshop. They included members of the Board of Selectmen, members of town committees. We had representatives from DCR and MWRA. We had community groups, different local businesses. There were representatives from the schools at the workshop as well. And what that diverse group of stakeholders does is it ensures that we have different opinions and different points of view well represented within the workshop, so that we can, cover as much ground as we can and make sure that we're not overlooking any concerns or priorities or actions within the community, so that everything is documented. And this group of stakeholders then comes together and discusses them and prioritize things across the whole range of, community stakeholders. So I'll move on to the summary of findings. We came out of the workshop. During the workshop, we had 4 different groups. Each group filled out an entire matrix with the information, gathering data about what are the important assets in town, what are the actions we should take. And we took all of those matrices, extracted all the information from them, and compiled all of them. There was a lot of overlap from different groups. So we made sure that we, combined the things that were in common among different groups and made sure we included the thoughts and comments from each of the groups into one cohesive document. And this is the document. I know there was a question about this before, but this document, it will be made available to the public. And it will be a public document. It just documents all the thoughts and priorities and actions identified by the stakeholders that participated in the workshop. So what does the summary of findings say? I'll start with the first step was identifying the hazards. We discussed all the potential hazards associated with climate change, and the group of stakeholders identified 4 of the top most critical assets that can impact Southborough negatively. The first one was heavy precipitation. We covered that before, but heavy rain, more frequent rain, increased volume of rain has a negative impact on your town infrastructure. So that was identified as one. Extreme weather events, maybe not so much hurricanes, but blizzards and storms and nor'easters have a detrimental impact and can really negatively impact Southborough. High and low temperatures were also identified. The need for extra air conditioning to help seniors or kids. There's a lot of implications with extreme temperatures. Protecting the vulnerable during extended periods of low temperatures was also a concern. So there's a lot of community resilience concerns that came up during the discussion of extreme temperatures. And then ironically, this was the week before the stay-at-home order came into place for COVID-19, but disease was brought up as a concern, and I think specifically a pandemic. I think we were in the early stages of this coronavirus, the coronavirus developments, and it did come up as one of the concerns that would expose the community's vulnerabilities, and it was very timely. And I think we could probably go back to that discussion and apply a lot of lessons learned based on the events that have happened from, since March, I think it was March 9th to today. So that it was good that was identified and was included. And I think there could probably be an update to the actions and the needs identified under that hazard. Also identified during the preliminary discussions were a few of the top concerns across all the groups. And these are the top concerns that were kind of identified during the discussion of the hazards. There were a lot of concerns regarding the causeways in town and the issues with causeways, limiting emergency response and creating traffic bottlenecks and kind of limiting the town's ability to respond to hazard events. The transportation network was also brought up as a concern with, a few number of major thoroughfares and a lot of cul-de-sac neighborhoods and dead ends, making also response difficult, making it easy for different neighborhoods to be isolated and to not be able to get in or out. So the causeways and the transportation network kind of go hand in hand, but a lot of the concerns regarding resilience and response to hazard events stemmed from issues with the causeways and the transportation networks. Also, utilities as they related to the causeways and having those be a weak point in the overall community resilience network. And then another top concern was wetland resources and your water bodies, specifically how stormwater impacts water quality for the water bodies in town. The reservoir being the primary concern because of the watershed and the water quality within the watershed and having to protect that as a resource. So those are kind of the big picture hazards and concerns that were addressed or that came up during the initial discussion with the stakeholders. And then using that information, we then broke out into 4 different groups that took the discussion further into more detail. So what came out of that more detailed discussion? As I described before, each of the 4 groups filled out the whole MVP matrix, which is, just a step-by-step process to identify hazards, the assets within the communities, identify actions that can be taken, and then prioritizing them. With these, full size matrices filled out for each group looked at everything they had listed there and identified their top 3 priorities to improve resilience. We then came back together as a whole group. Everybody shared their top 3 priorities, and we looked at all those priorities together and kind of identified where there was the most overlap and where there was the most concern identified by each of the groups. And there were 3 separate priorities that were identified by all the groups and pointed us toward these 3 as being the top priorities for the town as a whole. Now, there were a series of discrete actions identified within each of these top priorities, but they all kind of contributed to the same resilience theme and worked to improve resilience of these different issues specifically. So the first one was stormwater management. I think every single group had actions that addressed stormwater management and had identified those actions as a top priority. Among those were updating rainfall standards so that when you're looking at sizing culverts and retention basins and dealing with water in your town, that you're using the most up-to-date and scientifically accurate rainfall data that accounts for climate change and increases in precipitation over the next 50 to 100 years. Using out-of-date rainfall or not accounting for any increases over the next 30 to 50 years is not a good use of resources, because you make the upgrades and make the improvements, and then you're undersized and you're not accounting for the potential increases over the useful life of the project. Hand in hand with that were flood mitigation and stormwater BMP projects to address runoff from roads and protect water quality, to improve, to prevent flooding of roadways and mitigate those floods. So in that realm is stormwater BMPs to catch stormwater and treat it before it can impact the water quality in your watershed. Flood mitigation issues like upgrading culverts and increasing their flow capacity, and different projects to just better manage water within the town of Southborough to minimize damage to your infrastructure. The second priority to improve resilience that was identified was a category that we decided to call emergency services. I saw that a question just came in. I will address your question in 1 minute. Actually, I will address it now because it has to do with stormwater management. The question is, couldn't strategic land conservation be a part of stormwater management? The updated rainfall standards might speak to that and require conservation of certain areas to offset development. Yes, absolutely. I think you will see that increased land conservation efforts is under ecological health, but these are not discrete categories. There is certainly overlap between them. So stormwater management efforts could very well point to land conservation to help reduce the impacts of stormwater on the community. And I think there is certainly between stormwater management and ecological health, there's a lot of overlap in managing stormwater, protecting green spaces, and conserving land. Those definitely do go hand in hand. And I think there's the actions that are then implemented as a result of this plan, they will hopefully address more than one of these priorities. So if there's a project that is identified as a potential candidate for an MVP action grant, if it addresses, you know, a few of these top priorities within Southborough, it'll be a stronger contender for funding. And I think that combining some of these priorities is definitely a very good approach, and there's a lot of overlap. Melissa, I think we have somebody raised a hand as well.
Yeah, do you want me to allow them to talk?
Yeah, sure. We can take
Okay.
the question now.
All right, so Amy, I'm gonna click you in. Amy, did you have a question or a comment?
I think it was a mistake, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Oh, okay. No problem. Yeah, if anybody else has wants to ask their question instead of typing them, feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. Yeah, Freddie asked if I can let you know who is asking the question. I will let you know. The previous question about strategic land conservation was asked by Ashley Davies. I don't know, Melissa, do people have to identify themselves by address or something like that, like for a public meeting?
Because this isn't a board meeting, I don't think so.
Okay.
You know, if people want to, you know, if they're representing a certain community or organization, you're more than welcome to identify that as well. Unfortunately, I don't think there's the option to just make all attendees visible to everyone else. So we can only just see them as they are, but we'll make our best. Sorry. So I don't think they need to, I don't know if you heard my spiel before, I might have been muted. So they don't need to do the address, but if they're representing a certain organization, please, you know, feel to represent that. We can't make, unfortunately, the attendees kind of public. That's just kind of how the Zoom works on this side, but we'll make our best effort to acknowledge those who are speaking. If you have the options in the chat to make sure your chat is visible to all panelists and attendees, that'd be the best option. I know that's not always the case, so if not, we'll make sure that's visible to everyone, or at least audibly.
Thank you, Ashley. And thank you, Melissa. So yes, I think that the chat is visible to everybody. If you can, Ashley, like Ashley just did, and state who you're representing, I think that would be very helpful for the other attendees. Okay, I will get back to the presentation now then. So the second top priority to improve resilience that was identified during the workshop was a category of emergency services. That was related to the town's ability to respond to different hazard situations. The causeway improvements was a big one that was identified by a few of the groups. Improving the causeway in terms of carrying capacity, flood resilience, improving the resilience of the utilities that run through the causeways and can isolate or shut down utilities for entire sections of the town. Different improvements related to the causeways were identified as priority actions. In addition to that was taking a look at the sheltering capacity within the town for when there's extreme hazard events or extreme temperature events. Cooling centers, warming centers, storm shelters, and looking at whether the sheltering capacity within the town is adequate to meet the needs of the residents that need to evacuate their homes. And hand in hand with that is the continuity of services, and whether the plans for continuity of services in the face of these events are in place. That's an interesting one to have come up, because I think nobody was really prepared for our all digital lifestyle revolution of the last couple months. So there's probably some lessons learned and priority actions that have been identified after the last 2 months of trying to have town operations run mostly remotely. So it'll be interesting to do an update of the MVP findings and try to incorporate that in the update of the hazard mitigation plan to see if there's any additional steps within that category that have become apparent over the last several weeks. The last of the top priorities that was identified and had several different actions within this category is overall ecological health, the health of the ecosystems and the water bodies within Southborough, specifically protection of wetland resources and managing invasive species was a recurring theme that came up with the increased demand of development on towns like Southborough. Protecting some open spaces and wetland resources and managing invasive species is a top priority for preserving the quality of life and improving community resilience. And hand in hand with that was a desire to increase land conservation efforts across Southborough to ease some of that development pressure on the town and help preserve some of those ecological resources within the town. So the summary of findings, which as I mentioned before, will become a public document, outlines all the actions that were identified during the workshop and categorizes them in terms of high priority, medium priority, and low priority. But these were the top 3 categories that were identified and the actions that had the most support and were identified as the most critical to take steps on. So as the town of Southborough moves forward with the MVP plan, our next step is to integrate these findings into the hazard mitigation plan so that we have one cohesive hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan, which the town of Southborough can then use to guide decision-making and identify projects that can be funded to help improve community resilience. And so the next steps are the hazard mitigation plan and implementing some resilience projects. And that is, hold on, there we go. And that is an overview of the MVP process and our summary of findings and our outcomes. And at this point, I would be happy to take questions and elaborate on anything that we covered during this presentation.
All right, so we have a hand up. We're going to allow, right? Tim, are you there?
I think I'm here.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. I didn't hear a lot about resilience of the electrical grid, which is a problem, particularly in the winter, because when it's out for more than a few hours, people tend to lose heat. One of the things I've noticed, when there have been outages, is that they tend to impact fairly large chunks of the town, like 1,300, 1,500 households at a whack. And that tends to indicate that, we don't have sufficient redundancy or the ability to partition. The other thing that I would point out is that with temperature extremes, we also see things like, trees dying, which eventually finds its way to the, wired utilities. But at the moment, it can take, over a year for a dead tree to find its way up to the, top of the, we'll take it down list. So, figuring out, if there's money available to help facilitate that, that also seems like something that we ought to think about.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. And I think those are both excellent points. The utility resilience is an interesting one, and that is a big question. It did come up during the workshop when we were discussing the causeways and how they are a weak point in the resilience of the community, specifically because my understanding is that utility lines, electrical lines run along the causeways, and there have been issues with them going down at the causeway and entire sections of the town being without power. I do think one of the groups, at least one of the groups, mentioned an investigation of undergrounding utilities where possible or appropriate. So it is that is included in the report. It just didn't make it into the top 3 during the group discussions. And the management of trees is also an important point when dealing with the resilience of utility lines.
And well, undergrounding gets to be really, really expensive, like millions of dollars a mile. And so there was an effort on the Main Street project to do something there. But there are other things. I mean, if you drive up and down 85, we have a continuous problem with trees and vines and all this wrapping around power lines. And every once in a while, National Grid comes through and clears out some, but they don't clear out enough that it doesn't, come back long before they come back.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, if there's an opportunity to encourage them to do more, to figure out, how we invest in making that more robust, that's something that ought to be on the list and not just kind of buried.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm not representing anyone other than myself. I'm a resident, known as the general troublemaker. Yeah,
but that's we want your input and your feedback and your thoughts, and the comments that we get and the feedback we get during this meeting will be incorporated into the plan.
And Danielle, I think also on that point, if I remember correctly, I think it was Eversource who brought up, sometimes the fact of undergrounding utilities actually was not the best option for them and could cause more outages or longer outages because it took more time to access those utilities. So it's also a different weird perspective that we didn't normally think of coming up on those issues. But following up on Danielle's comment, it was definitely brought up in this during the workshop.
There can also be an issue with rising groundwater finding its way into undergrounded utilities.
Right.
I experienced that in another town where I own property. So I'm not going to prescribe how we solve the problem. I do think it's an issue that needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have anything else, Tim, or are you all set?
If something else occurs to me, I'll stick my hand back up.
All right, sounds good. I will move on to the next person then. So Freddie, you should be allowed to talk if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, hi. This is Freddie Gillespie, and my comments are as an individual, although I do chair the Open Space Preservation Commission, but these comments aren't from the commission. So I had a couple of questions. I was at that workshop, and I have 3 questions, so I'll try to. The first one is more of a comment in response to the last question about, or the comment about taking down trees that become a hazard for our wires and storm damage, and the real need to balance that with actually having more trees townwide. Pretty sure, I believe it's the town of Natick or the city of Natick, got a MVP follow-up grant after whatever it is after you do the planning to actually plant trees downtown, which increased their business profitability because people wanted to stay downtown. It's a heat island type of mitigation effort. So, whenever we talk about taking down trees, there's a real environmental cost, human cost for not having trees and the resulting heat impact, especially with rising temperatures. So that's just a comment that any planning, when you're talking about taking down trees, what's the plan to plant trees? And how do we do that on our narrow roads that don't have a lot of buffer between the street and the, no sidewalks? How do we do that to make up for trees that are coming down because of age or heat, or just because I'm not sure why, but so that was one. The second question is this the end of the presentation? Because I thought when we were at the workshop, it was said that they were going to include they took photos of all the worksheets that everyone had, and those were going to be made available in the follow-up workshop, which I think this is.
Yeah, so we do have pictures. Actually, we have scans of all the matrices that were developed during the workshop, and those are included in the actual report. So the MVP summary of findings report will be a public document that's available to the public. So you guys will have access to that, and the image of the matrices is included in that report.
Oh, great, because I think there was a lot of work and great information in there from
Oh, absolutely.
all different areas of town government
Yes.
and citizens and agencies. So that's great. And then the next question I have is, so now what? You talked about, and I didn't quite get it written down in my notes, but steps and, we're going to create action items. How does that process work? Who does that?
So it's led by the town and primarily your core team and Melissa. So once this document is finalized, as a town, you can look at the list of actions that are identified in the plan and basically pick one to take action on and try to get funding to implement the project. Oftentimes, the things that are identified as actions in the MVP plan aren't necessarily, shovel-ready projects. So there might be an intermediary step where you apply for funding to do a more detailed study or analysis, like Natick did for a study of how to increase tree canopy cover in their downtown area. You could identify something like that, or you could take action on a specific project and say, look at this culvert, this is undersized, let's do the design for this and try to get funding to get this project implemented.
So I guess my question is, we have this report here that doesn't identify specific projects, and that the town works on taking this report and creating specific projects, and that's done by the core team, not like groups like this?
It can be done by the core team, or it can be done by town committees, or it can be done by DPW, but it is within the purview of the town and the town staff and committees to identify which projects they want to have funded by an MVP action grant. So what this plan created is a list of possibilities, and there are some specific projects in there, but there's a lot more specific. There's a lot more efforts that would require extra steps to then identify an actual implementation project. But creating a stormwater management plan or rewriting your invasive species management plan, those are efforts that are not necessarily they're not necessarily construction projects, but they are projects that can be funded by the MVP program that will improve community resilience.
I'm sorry to take up the time, but it's still not clear to me. We have this plan here.
Yes.
And then is there another plan that comes out of this that is the one that then sets up which projects we look for funding for? Or is it just we take this and then work on this to see which projects we want to go for funding?
This plan identifies several projects for which you could apply for funding. Picking which one from the list you will apply for funding is the next step, and that is the town's next step.
Okay, so there's not another plan that comes after this. I guess you
No.
talked earlier about steps and something.
The next plan that comes out of this is really your hazard mitigation plan, and the actions identified in this MVP summary of findings get incorporated into your hazard mitigation plan. And the hazard mitigation plan does include an implementation plan where specific actions and specific projects, for lack of a better word, are identified and prioritized and assigned a timeline. And then it's, the town works to implement the things identified in that hazard mitigation plan. which I should correct myself. It will become a hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan.
And that plan itself, is that what you get is that the same plan that directs you for the funding for the projects from this plan?
Now you become eligible to apply for an MVP. And Hillary, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you become eligible to apply for an MVP action grant once we finish the MVP workshop process and the summary of findings. We're now going to be working on updating your hazard mitigation plan, but you will be eligible to apply for funding for MVP projects if you choose to apply for funding for the projects identified in this summary of findings.
Okay, thank you.
Go for it, Neal.
Oh, Freddie, it's Neal Freeze. Just to clarify, so there's two plans that are working in tandem here. The MVP is something new, and the hazard mitigation plan is something we've had for a while. They kind of drive towards the same goals. With the MVP, we'll be available to get MVP grants. Through the hazard mitigation, we'll be able to be eligible for hazard mitigation grants and other certain grants that come from FEMA and MEMA. So we'll have two plans that are kind of working towards the same goal and two funding sources. So hopefully that kind of clears up all the kind of side-by-side talk.
Yeah, so Hillary King from the MVP program just wrote in the comment section, if you haven't all seen it, that after this listening session, Southborough will be eligible for action grant funding.
Are there any other questions or comments out there? I don't see any hands raised, but we're still open for business. All right, I see Freddie. Hold on one second. Go ahead, Freddie.
Sorry for double dipping. So I guess my question is next steps. We have this plan. It's going to be made available, which will have more information in it than we just were presented the highlights, I would say. All the detail from that prior workshop will be in there. And there will be more detail on the actual 3 areas that we came up with?
Yes,
okay.
Correct.
So once we get that, does the state have any format of what the town does with it? Or is it just everyone who looks at it? Do we set up another group who's going to say, within these different areas, we should be looking at how we want to apply for funding? Because I believe you can only get 1 grant a year, right?
Whether it's a rule or not, but I think you would not. It is not a good approach to apply for more than 1 a year. In my would be my recommendation. And I think the next step for the town, based on the recommendations in the MVP plan, is to look at the different actions and try to see which one is the best fit for the MVP program and which project would be, the best candidate to get funding. There might be projects that are great and are top priority for the town, but aren't the best fit for the MVP program and are less likely to get funded. So balancing your priorities with the chance of funding from the town and the fit with the priorities of the MVP program is kind of the goal.
And is that something we need to have another workshop on, how to do that? It's like there's a 25% commitment from the town on any of these projects, and
correct.
Is it a $2 million cap, but they only have 10 million, so statewide?
Yeah, the current round of funding is open. The applications are actually due next week. So I'm guessing that Southborough will not be applying for this round. You'll probably wait for the next round, but they currently have $10 million available. Projects can be up to $2 million, but they have to be completed within, well, you can either propose a 1-year project or a 2-year project, and you have to break down your funding based on fiscal year. And they have different criteria that you have to meet and criteria against which they score your application. So for example, environmental benefits score pretty high in terms of, you know, the quality of the proposal. So you want to pick projects that have that have good resilience components, that have nature-based solutions or very obvious ecological benefits. Regional projects get extra points also. So there's a series of scoring criteria for the application, and you kind of have to weigh that against the list of projects that you have and see which ones you think are the best fit. Now, how you go through that process is, I think it's kind of up to the core team, whether they want to do it, whether they want to do it in conjunction with other town committees. There is no strict guidelines as to how you pick what you're going to apply for. The town can kind of proceed with what they think fits in with their goals and priorities.
So, but I tried to find the grant and the point system. Is that something that you could, or Melissa can send out? I understand that nature-based solutions get you a much higher point for being more competitive against, because I'm imagining many towns are applying for these funds.
Yes.
So that your project, you want to put your best project forth, that's the one that's likeliest to get funded, and knowing which one is the most competitive would be beneficial. And I believe I heard that nature-based solutions are the highest point grabbers.
Yeah, nature-based solutions are definitely strongly encouraged within the program because they provide a lot of resilience benefits. If you, Melissa or I can certainly share the link, but the state has an MVP program website, and on that website, they have links to the actual notice of funding that outlines the guidelines for applying for funding and outlines exactly the point scoring criteria for these projects. It also has a link to all the MVP plans for every single community that has an approved MVP plan. So every community that has been designated an MVP community, their plan is public, and you can read through those. And then the other thing that's probably the most interesting for you to go look at is the announcement of which projects have been funded and by how much. As a reference, I'm hesitant to say exact numbers, so these might be approximate, but I think in the last round of funding, there were about 110 applications for MVP action grants. And I think there were 54 different projects that were funded. So, it's a pretty good ratio of projects that have been funded. Now, I don't know what the level of funding was compared to what they were requesting, or if they were fully funded or not. But there's been a lot of really good projects that have been funded through the program, and there's a pretty wide range of projects from plans to actual implementation. And so there's a pretty broad range of successful projects out there. And I think it's, you won't have a problem identifying a project that would be a good candidate for the MVP program. And then it's just a matter of getting a strong application together.
Thank you.
And Freddie, also Hillary King, who again is our MVP coordinator kind of for our region, has been a great resource through all of this as well. And she just kind of mentioned that she'd be willing to sit down, with us if we're interested, obviously after the 11th when it closes, because they can't talk about projects, but that might help get an overall or better sense on how things are graded. So that's something that we can, set up from, after her, when she's allowed to talk about it. But
So we could set up a Zoom meeting.
yeah, or
That'd be good.
Okay, and I think Tim also posted a link to the MVP page, so you might be able to find that information there, probably in the RFR.
I got there, and then I got to the states.
Yeah. Well,
I didn't want to look at the the state, you know what I'm
Yeah.
talking about, where
Yeah.
it's too much. I just wanted to know what something simple.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get that to you, or I'll get it to you, one or the other.
I've spent a bit of time on that website. It's not like I haven't been there.
All right. Freddie, did you have anything else? Or
No, that was it. Thank you.
Okay. Is there anyone else that had any comments or questions? And Tim, thank you for posting that link in the chat for anyone else who wanted to follow that directly. All right, I'm not seeing any more hands up. All right. Well, it looks like that might be it. So Danielle, do you have anything else you wanted to add, or?
No, I just want to say thank you. It was a pleasure to work with the town of Southborough on this. I look forward to working through the hazard mitigation plan update. And it's a great community, and it was nice to see a good active participation in our workshop.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending. You know, in this webinar times, you know, we got a nice crowd going. And then, you know, if you don't already, make sure you follow kind of the notifications from the Conservation Commission news and announcements site, and just the regular town updates as well for other information. But once this plan comes available, you know, I'll post it on the Concom site, and it'll send out kind of that mass email. So that's kind of the best way to get that as soon as it's ready. But in the meantime, you know, keep a lookout for the hazard mitigation plan webinar. You know, that'll be coming up in the next few months. And we had, I think, about 19 or so people, you know, at the height of it. I'm sorry, you guys can't see the participants list in this kind of webinar setting, but if there isn't any other questions, you know, you're also willing to email me. I can put my email in the chat, or it's also available on the town's website. I think most of you are on here know me anyways, but thank you all for coming. I think we all really appreciate it. And in the future, if you have questions, just please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you. Everyone have a good night.